For centuries, one question has quietly shaped the way people view human history. Why did Europe rise to dominate much of the modern world, while Africa followed a very different path? At first glance, the answer can seem obvious to many people. Europe industrialized rapidly. European empires crossed oceans, built massive colonial networks, and eventually controlled enormous parts of the planet. Meanwhile, much of Africa faced colonization, exploitation, and economic struggle during the modern era. Over time, this imbalance created dangerous myths, ideas suggesting that one civilization or even one race was somehow naturally superior to another. But history is rarely that simple. Because when we look deeper into the human story, the entire picture begins to change. The truth is that Africa was not behind humanity. Africa was humanity's beginning. Long before the first European kingdoms emerged, before Greece, Rome, or medieval castles, human beings were already evolving beneath African skies. The first modern humans walked across African savannas hundreds of thousands of years ago. Every person alive today, regardless of race, nationality, or culture, ultimately traces their ancestry back to Africa. In a very real sense, all human history begins there. So if humanity shares the same origins, how did different civilizations develop along such different paths? Why did certain regions industrialize earlier? Why did some societies build massive global empires while others evolved differently? And perhaps most importantly, was it ever truly about intelligence or biological superiority at all? Modern science increasingly points toward another explanation entirely. A story shaped not by better humans, but by geography, climate, crops, animals, disease, migration, and historical timing. Some continents possessed plants that could easily be farmed and stored. Others contained animals suitable for domestication. Certain regions allowed ideas and technologies to spread rapidly across similar climates, while others were divided by deserts, jungles, mountains, and deadly disease zones. Over thousands of years, these environmental differences quietly shaped the destiny of civilizations long before modern nations ever existed. History in many ways became a giant geographical lottery. But this story is also more complicated than maps and climate alone. Colonialism violently reshaped entire continents. Slave trades devastated populations. Empires extracted wealth while rewriting historical narratives. Pseudoscientific racism later emerged to justify conquest and inequality, convincing generations that human differences reflected hierarchy rather than adaptation. Yet modern genetics tells another story entirely. Beneath variations in skin color, facial features, and physical appearance, all humans remain overwhelmingly similar. The traits we associate with race are often the result of environmental adaptation unfolding over thousands of years, responses to sunlight, temperature, altitude, diet, and disease. Human diversity reflects survival, not superiority. And perhaps that realization changes everything. Because this is not a documentary about proving one civilization greater than another. It is a journey into the hidden forces that shaped human history itself. A story about deserts and oceans, about crops and horses, about disease and migration, about empires, colonization, survival, and misunderstanding. And ultimately, it is the story of how one human species evolved into many different civilizations while still remaining deeply connected to a shared origin stretching back to ancient Africa, the birthplace of us all. Long before the rise of Europe, before the pyramids of Egypt, before the first cities of Mesopotamia, before Rome, Greece, or China, humanity itself was taking its first steps beneath African skies. The story of civilization does not begin in Europe. It begins in Africa. For millions of years, the African continent served as the stage upon which human evolution slowly unfolded. Vast savannas, dense jungles, enormous deserts, and fertile valleys created one of the most environmentally diverse regions on Earth. In these ancient landscapes, early ancestors of modern humans struggled to survive against predators, climate shifts, droughts, and constantly changing environments. And through that struggle, humanity was born. Scientists today believe some of the earliest human ancestors emerged in Africa several million years ago. Creatures such as Australopithecus walked upright across the savannas long before modern humans existed. Later came Homo habilis, one of the first tool-using species, followed by Homo erectus, who learned to control fire and eventually spread beyond Africa into other parts of the world. But the most important transformation came much later. Roughly 300,000 years ago, the first modern humans, Homo sapiens, appeared in Africa. These early humans already possessed the minds that would eventually create civilizations, art, religion, science, and empires. The people who painted caves in Europe, built cities in Asia, crossed oceans, and shaped the modern world all descended from populations that once lived entirely within Africa. Every person alive today ultimately traces their ancestry back to this continent. In a very real sense, Africa is not simply part of human history. It is the foundation of human history itself. For thousands of generations, early humans adapted to Africa's extraordinary environmental diversity. Some groups survived in scorching deserts beneath relentless sunlight. Others lived within tropical rainforests filled with dangerous animals and thick vegetation. Some communities thrived beside lakes and rivers, while others crossed open grasslands following migrating herds. This environmental diversity forced human beings to become highly adaptable. Humans learned to hunt, cooperate, communicate, and innovate in order to survive. They developed tools, social structures, language, and early forms of culture. Over immense stretches of time, these adaptations shaped the human species itself. Then something extraordinary happened. Small groups of humans began leaving Africa. Scientists believe waves of migration slowly moved northward into the Middle East and eventually spread outward across Europe, Asia, Australia, and later the Americas. These journeys unfolded over thousands of years through harsh climates, frozen landscapes, mountain ranges, and unfamiliar ecosystems. The people who entered Europe faced entirely new environmental pressures compared to their ancestors in Africa. Different temperatures, sunlight levels, diets, and diseases slowly influenced physical adaptations across generations. Human populations gradually changed in appearance as they adjusted to local environments. But despite these differences, all humans remain part of the same species. Modern genetics has revealed something astonishing. Human beings are incredibly similar to one another genetically. In fact, there is often more genetic diversity within Africa itself than between many populations outside of it. Because humanity originated there, African populations preserved the deepest and oldest branches of human genetic variation. The farther humans migrated from Africa, the smaller the migrating populations became, carrying only portions of that diversity with them. This means Africa does not represent a separate human story from Europe or Asia. Africa is the original human story. Yet for centuries, colonial narratives often ignored or minimized this reality. European empires frequently portrayed Africa as disconnected from civilization while overlooking the continent's central role in human origins and global history. Racist ideologies later distorted science in attempts to justify conquest and inequality. But modern archaeology, anthropology, and genetics have fundamentally changed our understanding. Today the evidence is overwhelming. The first humans were African. The first human societies were African. And every civilization on Earth ultimately emerged from ancestors who once walked across ancient African landscapes beneath the same stars we see today. Understanding this changes the way we see history itself. Because before nations, empires, religions, or races existed, humanity was already one people. And our shared story began in Africa, the cradle of humankind. When people think about the rise of civilizations, they often focus on kings, armies, inventions, or great leaders. But hidden beneath almost every chapter of human history lies another force, silent, invisible, and unbelievably powerful. Geography. Mountains, rivers, deserts, climates, coastlines, and animals shaped human destiny long before nations or empires even existed. In many ways, civilizations were not only built by human decisions. They were shaped by the environments surrounding them. And when we compare Europe and Africa, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The continents themselves were not created equally. At first glance, this may sound unfair or even controversial. But geography does not distribute opportunity evenly. Some regions naturally allowed ideas, crops, and technologies to spread more easily than others. Over thousands of years, these differences quietly influenced the direction of human history. One of the most important differences was the shape of the continents themselves. Eurasia, the massive landmass connecting Europe and Asia, stretches primarily east to west. Africa, by contrast, stretches mostly north to south. This seemingly simple difference changed everything. Because climates tend to remain more similar across east-west distances than north-south ones. Regions located along the same latitude often share similar temperatures, seasons, rainfall patterns, and daylight cycles. This meant crops, animals, technologies, and ideas could spread across Eurasia relatively easily. A farming method developed in the Middle East could eventually spread into Europe or Asia because the environmental conditions remained somewhat familiar. But Africa presented a completely different challenge. Traveling north to south across Africa meant crossing radically different climate zones. The scorching Sahara Desert separated North Africa from the tropical regions farther south. Dense rainforests blocked movement in Central Africa. Farther south came savannas, mountains, river systems, and entirely different ecological environments. A crop thriving in one African region might completely fail in another. Animals adapted to one climate could not easily survive elsewhere. And ideas themselves traveled more slowly because the environments changed so dramatically. The Sahara alone became one of the greatest natural barriers in human history. Stretching across enormous distances, the desert limited communication and migration between Mediterranean civilizations and sub-Saharan Africa for centuries. Although trade routes eventually crossed the Sahara using camels, movement remained dangerous, slow, and difficult. Meanwhile, Europe benefited from another geographical advantage: navigable rivers and coastlines. Europe contains numerous rivers that connect deep inland regions to the sea. Rivers such as the Rhine, Danube, Seine, and Thames allowed goods, people, technologies, and ideas to move relatively efficiently between distant regions. Europe's long coastlines and natural harbors also encouraged maritime trade and exploration. Africa's geography worked differently. Many African rivers are interrupted by rapids, waterfalls, seasonal flooding, or difficult terrain that limited long-distance navigation. Dense jungles and tropical diseases further complicated transportation and communication across large areas. This did not make African societies less intelligent or less capable. It simply meant they developed under different environmental conditions. And geography continued influencing nearly every aspect of civilization. In Eurasia, connected land routes helped spread inventions such as writing systems, metalworking, wheeled transport, and agricultural technologies across enormous distances. Trade networks linked distant societies for centuries, allowing ideas to accumulate and evolve more rapidly over time. Africa also possessed major trade networks and powerful civilizations, but the environmental obstacles between regions often slowed the spread of innovations compared to Eurasia's vast interconnected zones. Then there was disease. Tropical regions in Africa contained deadly illnesses such as malaria and sleeping sickness that shaped patterns of settlement, farming, and migration for thousands of years. Certain environments became difficult for both humans and domesticated animals to survive within. Some regions remained sparsely populated not because humans lacked ability, but because disease ecology made large-scale expansion far more difficult. Climate also shaped food production itself. Some regions of Eurasia possessed fertile environments ideal for large-scale grain agriculture capable of producing stable food surpluses. These surpluses helped support population growth, cities, specialized labor, armies, and eventually industrial societies. Africa developed its own agricultural systems adapted to local climates, but environmental conditions often varied more dramatically between regions. Over thousands of years, these small differences accumulated, and history began moving along different paths. But perhaps the most important thing to understand is this: geography influences opportunity. It does not determine human worth. No continent was filled with better humans than another. Civilizations adapted creatively to the environments they inherited. Some societies developed around rivers, others around deserts, forests, or grasslands. Human beings everywhere used intelligence, innovation, and survival skills to overcome the challenges surrounding them. Yet the environments themselves shaped what was easier and what was harder. In many ways, history became a giant geographical lottery played across thousands of years. And the consequences of that lottery would eventually reshape the entire world. Throughout history, animals have shaped human civilization in ways most people rarely think about. They carried armies across continents, pulled plows through farmland, transported goods between cities, provided meat, milk, clothing, leather, fertilizer, and labor. Some animals even changed the outcome of wars and helped build entire empires. And when we compare the historical development of Europe and Africa, one surprising question emerges. Why did Eurasia domesticate horses, cows, sheep, and goats, while Africa never fully domesticated animals like zebras? At first, the answer seems simple. A zebra looks remarkably similar to a horse. So why didn't African civilizations ride zebras into battle or use them to pull wagons across the continent? The answer reveals something profound about the hidden role of nature in shaping human history. Because not all animals can be domesticated. Thousands of years ago, humans across the world began experimenting with taming wild animals. Some species gradually adapted to living beside humans, while others remained too aggressive, unpredictable, or difficult to control. Over time, only a surprisingly small number of large mammals proved truly suitable for domestication. And most of those animals happened to live in Eurasia. Horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and several other useful species evolved across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. These animals possessed traits that made them unusually compatible with human societies. Many naturally lived in herds with social hierarchies, meaning humans could replace dominant leaders within the group. Others reproduced relatively quickly in captivity and tolerated human control. The horse became especially revolutionary. Once domesticated, horses transformed transportation, communication, agriculture, and warfare. Humans could suddenly travel enormous distances faster than ever before. Armies became more mobile. Trade expanded across continents. Entire empires rose partly because mounted warriors could move rapidly across open terrain. From the Mongols of Central Asia to European cavalry forces, horses changed the balance of power throughout history. Africa, however, faced a very different environmental reality. The continent possessed many large animals, zebras, elephants, rhinoceroses, buffalo, hippos, and others, but most proved extremely difficult or impossible to domesticate effectively. Zebras, despite their horse-like appearance, are highly aggressive and unpredictable. Unlike horses, zebras evolved under intense predator pressure from lions, hyenas, and other dangerous hunters across African savannas. As a result, zebras developed survival instincts based on aggression and panic. They bite viciously, kick unpredictably, and resist human control far more aggressively than horses. Attempts to domesticate zebras throughout history repeatedly failed because the animals simply lacked the temperament needed for long-term cooperation with humans. Other African animals presented similar challenges. African buffalo remained dangerous and difficult to control. Elephants were intelligent but difficult to breed in captivity on a large scale. Many species migrated seasonally across enormous distances, making stable domestication even harder. But animals shaped history in another invisible way too. Disease. Many African regions contain deadly diseases spread by insects and parasites, including the tsetse fly, which carried sleeping sickness. This disease affected both humans and livestock, making large-scale animal domestication difficult across significant portions of Africa. Even horses often struggled to survive in certain tropical environments. This created enormous long-term consequences. In Eurasia, domesticated animals helped increase agricultural production dramatically. Oxen and horses pulled plows through farmland, allowing humans to cultivate larger areas more efficiently. Food surpluses supported growing populations, cities, specialized workers, and powerful states. Animals also transformed transportation. Carts, wagons, cavalry forces, messenger systems, and trade caravans connected distant civilizations across Eurasia for centuries. Technologies and ideas spread faster because humans possessed animal-powered mobility. And perhaps most importantly of all, close contact with domesticated animals gradually exposed Eurasian populations to animal diseases over thousands of years. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza originally evolved from interactions between humans and livestock. Over generations, Eurasian populations developed partial immunities to many illnesses through repeated exposure. Later, when Europeans crossed oceans during the colonial era, these diseases devastated populations in the Americas and other regions that lacked similar exposure histories. In this sense, domesticated animals indirectly reshaped world history itself. But none of this means African civilizations lacked intelligence, innovation, or sophistication. African societies adapted brilliantly to the environments they inherited. Some regions developed highly successful pastoral cultures based around cattle herding. Others built trade empires, advanced kingdoms, and agricultural systems suited to local conditions. Human beings everywhere worked creatively with the natural world surrounding them. The difference was environmental opportunity. Certain continents simply possessed more domesticable animals than others. And over thousands of years, those small environmental advantages accumulated into enormous historical consequences. The rise of civilizations was not determined by superior humans. Often, it depended on something far stranger: the animals living beside them. When people think about the forces that shaped civilizations, they usually imagine kings, armies, inventions, or great battles. But some of history's most powerful forces were completely invisible. Tiny organisms, bacteria, viruses, parasites, and mosquitoes, helped determine where civilizations could rise, where populations could grow, and even which empires would dominate the world. Climate and disease quietly shaped human history for thousands of years. And nowhere was this more important than in Africa. Africa's environments were among the most biologically challenging on Earth. Tropical heat, dense jungles, seasonal flooding, and insect-rich ecosystems created conditions where dangerous diseases could spread rapidly. For early human societies, survival was not only a struggle against predators or famine. It was also a battle against invisible enemies. Among the deadliest was malaria. Spread through mosquito bites, malaria has haunted tropical regions for thousands of years. The disease causes fever, weakness, organ failure, and often death. Even today, malaria remains one of the world's most dangerous illnesses. In the ancient world, before modern medicine existed, entire populations lived under constant threat from mosquito-borne disease. This changed the course of history more than most people realize. Certain regions of Africa became extremely difficult for outsiders to survive within. Travelers, armies, and settlers entering tropical zones often died from diseases their bodies had never encountered before. European explorers later referred to parts of West Africa as the white man's grave, because mortality rates among foreigners became so terrifyingly high. Disease acted almost like an invisible border protecting large parts of Africa for centuries. Another major threat came from the tsetse fly, which carried sleeping sickness, a disease affecting both humans and livestock. In many regions, horses and cattle struggled to survive because of these infections. This limited transportation, farming methods, and large-scale animal domestication across parts of the continent. Climate and disease worked together as powerful environmental barriers. Meanwhile, Eurasia experienced very different ecological conditions. Europe and parts of Asia contained colder climates and seasonal weather patterns that reduced the spread of many tropical diseases. More importantly, Eurasian societies lived in close contact with domesticated animals such as cows, pigs, sheep, and horses for thousands of years. This relationship created both danger and advantage. Many deadly human diseases originally evolved from animals. Smallpox, influenza, measles, and other illnesses likely emerged through centuries of interaction between humans and livestock. Over time, Eurasian populations repeatedly survived outbreaks, slowly developing partial immunities across generations. The process was brutal. Millions died in recurring epidemics. But survivors passed stronger immune defenses to future generations. In a strange and tragic way, constant exposure to disease helped build resistance. Africa also developed remarkable biological adaptations to disease environments. One of the most famous examples is the sickle cell trait. People carrying certain genetic variations gained partial protection against severe malaria, increasing survival chances in tropical regions where the disease remained common. This adaptation demonstrates something important about human evolution. Physical differences between populations often emerged as survival responses to local environments. Not superiority. Not inferiority. Adaptation. Climate also shaped daily life in countless other ways. In colder European climates, people built insulated housing, wore heavy layered clothing, and depended on stored food during harsh winters. Seasonal weather patterns encouraged long-term food storage and agricultural planning. In many African regions, hotter climates influenced architecture designed for airflow and cooling. Different rainfall patterns shaped farming methods, migration patterns, and settlement structures. Human societies adapted creatively to the conditions surrounding them. Even skin color reflects this environmental relationship. Near the equator, stronger sunlight favored darker skin rich in melanin, which helped protect against ultraviolet radiation. In regions farther from the equator with weaker sunlight, lighter skin gradually evolved to absorb more vitamin D efficiently. Human appearance became deeply connected to geography and climate over thousands of years. But disease would later shape world history in even more devastating ways. When Europeans began exploring and colonizing other continents, they carried diseases with them that populations elsewhere had never encountered before. In the Americas especially, smallpox, measles, influenza, and other illnesses spread catastrophically among indigenous populations lacking immunity. Entire civilizations collapsed beneath epidemic waves. Some historians estimate that diseases killed tens of millions across the Americas after European contact, one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. And ironically, Europeans themselves often struggled to survive in tropical Africa because local disease environments remained deadly to outsiders for centuries. This reveals one of history's deepest truths. No civilization was naturally invincible everywhere. Human success always depended upon environment. Climate and disease shaped which societies could expand, where populations could grow, and how civilizations evolved across time. Invisible microbes influenced migration, warfare, colonization, economics, and survival more powerfully than many kings or armies ever could. Yet for centuries people misunderstood these differences. Some assumed certain civilizations succeeded because of superiority rather than environmental advantage and historical circumstance. But modern science paints a more complicated picture. History was shaped not only by human ambition, but by rivers, deserts, animals, climate, and invisible organisms drifting silently through the air. For most of human history, survival depended entirely on nature. People hunted animals, gathered wild plants, followed migrating herds, and constantly searched for food across dangerous landscapes. Human populations remained relatively small because nature itself limited how many people could survive. Then, around 12,000 years ago, one of the greatest transformations in human history began. Agriculture. Human beings slowly learned that certain plants could be cultivated intentionally instead of simply gathered from the wild. Villages formed beside fertile land. Food could now be stored for future seasons. Populations began growing rapidly. And over thousands of years, agriculture changed everything. Cities emerged. Kingdoms formed. Governments, armies, religions, writing systems, and eventually civilizations themselves all grew from the stability that farming made possible. But agriculture did not develop equally everywhere. Different continents possessed different plants, climates, and environmental conditions. Some regions happened to contain crops unusually suited for large-scale farming and long-term storage. Others faced far greater agricultural challenges. And these differences would quietly shape the future of civilizations. In parts of the Middle East and Eurasia, humans discovered highly productive grains such as wheat and barley. These crops possessed several enormous advantages. They grew densely, produced large amounts of calories, and could be stored for long periods without spoiling. This was revolutionary. Stored grain created food surpluses capable of feeding large populations even during winter or drought. Farmers no longer needed every person in society focused entirely on finding food. Some people could become soldiers, builders, priests, craftsmen, traders, scholars, or rulers. Agriculture created specialization. And specialization accelerated civilization. Eurasia's east-west geography also helped these farming systems spread rapidly across connected climates. Crops developed in one region could often survive in neighboring lands with similar seasons and temperatures. Farming knowledge moved across continents over generations, increasing productivity and population growth. Europe eventually inherited many of these agricultural advantages. Large food surpluses supported growing cities, expanding states, and increasingly complex economies. Over centuries, agricultural efficiency became one of the foundations for industrialization itself. Africa, however, developed agriculture under very different environmental conditions. The continent possessed important crops of its own, including millet, sorghum, yams, teff, and various forms of rice adapted to African climates. African farmers built sophisticated agricultural systems suited to deserts, savannas, tropical forests, and seasonal rainfall patterns. But farming conditions often remained more difficult and unpredictable across large regions. Tropical climates, poor soils in certain areas, irregular rainfall, drought cycles, and dangerous plant diseases complicated large-scale agricultural expansion. Some crops thrived only in specific local environments and could not spread easily across the continent because Africa's climate zones changed so dramatically from north to south. The Sahara Desert created another massive obstacle. Communication and agricultural exchange between North Africa and sub-Saharan regions remained limited for long periods. Unlike Eurasia's connected farming belt, African agricultural systems often developed more independently within separate ecological zones. Disease also affected farming itself. In tropical regions, insects and parasites damaged crops, livestock, and human populations alike. Certain environments proved difficult for large domesticated animals used in plowing and transportation. Without widespread animal-powered farming systems like those found in parts of Eurasia, agricultural expansion sometimes moved more slowly. But none of this means African societies lacked innovation. Far from it. African civilizations developed remarkable agricultural knowledge adapted precisely to local environments. Farmers mastered seasonal rhythms, drought-resistant crops, irrigation systems, terraced farming, cattle herding, and ecological survival techniques refined across generations. In places such as the Sahel and Nile regions, complex farming systems supported powerful kingdoms and major trade networks for centuries. Human intelligence existed everywhere. The environments simply created different opportunities and limitations. And over thousands of years, small differences in agricultural productivity accumulated into enormous historical consequences. Food surplus determines population growth. Population growth supports larger cities and armies. Cities encourage specialization and innovation. Innovation strengthens states and economies. Civilizations build upon previous generations like layers stacked across time. Agriculture became the foundation beneath all of it. But perhaps the most important lesson is this. The rise of civilizations was never purely about intelligence or human value. It was deeply connected to geography, climate, and environmental luck. Some societies inherited crops capable of supporting enormous centralized states. Others adapted brilliantly to harsher ecological realities requiring different forms of survival. History followed those paths accordingly. And the destinies of continents began diverging long before modern nations ever existed, shaped quietly by seeds planted thousands of years ago beneath very different skies. As human populations grew larger through agriculture, societies began changing in ways that would reshape history forever. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. And eventually, powerful states and empires emerged across the world. For the first time, large groups of people lived under centralized rulers, organized armies, taxation systems, religious institutions, and complex governments capable of controlling enormous territories. Kings, emperors, and ruling elites concentrated power into political centers that shaped the lives of millions. But states and empires did not evolve identically everywhere. Different environments created different forms of political organization. And once again, geography quietly influenced the path civilizations followed. In Europe and parts of Eurasia, competition between neighboring states became constant. Mountain ranges, rivers, fertile plains, and fragmented territories created a world filled with rival kingdoms constantly fighting for land, resources, and influence. No single empire controlled Europe permanently for long. Instead, many competing powers emerged side by side. This rivalry had enormous consequences. Kings invested heavily in military technology, fortifications, navigation, trade, and political alliances in order to survive against their neighbors. Competition encouraged innovation because weaker states risked conquest or collapse. Over centuries, warfare accelerated advancements in weapons, administration, engineering, and finance. Political fragmentation created instability, but it also fueled rapid change. Meanwhile, Africa developed powerful states and empires of its own, though often under very different environmental conditions. Along the Nile River, kingdoms and centralized authority emerged thousands of years ago in one of the world's earliest civilizations, ancient Egypt. Farther south and west, African empires later rose through control of trade routes, gold resources, agriculture, and regional influence. The Mali Empire became one of the richest states in medieval history, controlling vast trans-Saharan trade networks connecting West Africa to North Africa and the Islamic world. Cities such as Timbuktu became centers of learning, scholarship, trade, and religion. The Songhai Empire later expanded across large portions of West Africa, developing organized armies, taxation systems, and administrative structures. In East Africa, kingdoms and trading cities along the Swahili coast connected Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond through Indian Ocean commerce. Farther south, Great Zimbabwe emerged as a major political and economic center built through trade, cattle wealth, and regional influence. Africa was never isolated from civilization. It contained thriving political systems, trade empires, and centers of power for centuries. But geography continued shaping how these states formed. In many African regions, deserts, jungles, mountains, and disease zones limited centralized expansion across enormous territories. Communication between distant populations remained difficult in some environments, making long-term political unity harder to maintain. As a result, many African societies evolved through decentralized political systems rather than massive territorial empires. Power often remained distributed among clans, villages, tribal federations, councils, or regional leaders adapted to local conditions. And importantly, decentralization did not mean weakness or primitiveness. In some environments, smaller flexible systems proved more practical than highly centralized governments. Communities organized themselves according to ecological realities, trade patterns, migration needs, and cultural traditions. Human societies adapted politically just as they adapted biologically. Europe's environment encouraged constant state competition. Many African environments encouraged regional diversity and localized systems of authority. Neither path reflected greater intelligence. Only different historical pressures. Trade also shaped political power differently across continents. European states increasingly focused on maritime expansion, overseas commerce, and naval dominance. Competition for trade routes eventually pushed European powers into global exploration and colonization. African empires, meanwhile, often grew wealthy through control of internal trade routes involving gold, salt, ivory, textiles, and other resources moving across deserts and coastlines. For centuries, trans-Saharan caravans connected African kingdoms to wider global markets. But then history shifted dramatically. As European maritime technology advanced, Atlantic trade routes began replacing older land-based systems. Coastal access became increasingly important in global economics. European powers gained growing advantages through naval expansion, industrialization, and eventually colonial conquest. The balance of global power slowly changed. Yet despite these later transformations, one truth remains clear. Africa possessed sophisticated political systems long before colonialism arrived. Empires rose. Kingdoms flourished. Trade networks connected distant peoples. Centers of learning and wealth emerged across the continent. The idea that Africa lacked civilization before European intervention is historically false. What differed were the environmental conditions shaping how power concentrated across societies. Some civilizations developed through centralized territorial empires. Others through regional networks and decentralized authority. History followed many paths, but all were shaped by the environments surrounding them. And over centuries, the structure of states and empires would determine which civilizations gained military power, economic influence, and eventually global dominance in the modern age. Human civilization did not advance in sudden leaps. It evolved gradually, invention by invention, idea by idea, generation after generation. One discovery led to another. A farming tool improved food production. Food surplus supported larger cities. Cities created scholars, craftsmen, engineers, and merchants. New ideas spread through trade routes and written records. And over centuries, knowledge accumulated like compound interest. Small advantages slowly became enormous ones. This process shaped the rise of civilizations across the world. But the speed at which knowledge accumulated depended heavily on one critical factor: connection. Civilizations that remained linked through trade, communication, migration, and shared learning often advanced more rapidly because innovations could spread and improve continuously across large networks. And this became one of Eurasia's greatest long-term advantages. For thousands of years, Europe, the Middle East, India, and China remained connected through overlapping trade routes stretching across Eurasia. Goods, ideas, technologies, religions, and scientific discoveries traveled enormous distances between civilizations. Paper moved from China westward. Mathematics spread through the Islamic world into Europe. Gunpowder transformed warfare. Navigation tools crossed oceans. Knowledge rarely stayed isolated forever. One civilization's discovery often became another civilization's foundation. Over time, innovation began accelerating. Writing systems played a major role in this process. Written language allowed knowledge to survive beyond human memory. Laws, engineering methods, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and scientific observations could now be preserved for future generations rather than disappearing when elders died. Civilizations built intellectual foundations layer by layer. Libraries became storage systems for civilization itself. In Europe especially, the printing press later transformed the spread of information dramatically. Before printing, books had to be copied by hand, making knowledge expensive and limited. But once printing technology spread across Europe in the 15th century, ideas traveled faster than ever before. Scientific discoveries, political theories, maps, engineering designs, and religious debates could now reach enormous audiences rapidly. Knowledge multiplied. And the more knowledge accumulated, the faster future discoveries emerged. This created a powerful feedback loop. Technology accelerated technology. Innovation accelerated innovation. The process resembled financial compound interest, where small gains continuously build upon previous gains until growth becomes explosive. Europe eventually entered this accelerating cycle during the scientific revolution and industrial revolution. Machines replaced manual labor. Steam engines transformed transportation. Factories reshaped economies. Advanced weaponry changed warfare. Naval technology enabled global exploration and empire building. By the 19th century, industrial Europe possessed technological advantages capable of reshaping the world itself. But this does not mean innovation existed only in Europe. Far from it. African civilizations also produced remarkable technological achievements often ignored or minimized in traditional historical narratives. Ironworking spread across parts of Africa centuries ago, with some regions developing advanced metalworking traditions independently. African blacksmiths forged tools, weapons, and agricultural equipment essential to daily life and trade. Architecture flourished as well. Great Zimbabwe's massive stone structures demonstrated sophisticated engineering and construction techniques. In West Africa, cities such as Timbuktu became intellectual centers containing libraries, universities, and scholarship connected to the wider Islamic world. African trade networks crossed deserts, rivers, and coastlines linking distant societies through commerce and cultural exchange. In many regions, technological innovation focused on adaptation to local environments rather than industrial expansion. Agricultural methods evolved for tropical climates. Navigation systems adapted to rivers and deserts. Communities developed deep ecological knowledge regarding medicine, weather, livestock, and land management. Human intelligence existed everywhere. But geography once again shaped how rapidly technology spread and accumulated. Eurasia's connected trade routes allowed inventions to circulate across enormous distances between densely populated civilizations. Europe later gained additional advantages through maritime expansion, colonial wealth, and access to global resources during industrialization. Meanwhile, Africa's environmental barriers, deserts, jungles, disease zones, and fragmented ecological regions, often slowed the large-scale movement of technologies compared to Eurasia's vast interconnected systems. Colonialism would later deepen these imbalances dramatically. European powers extracted resources while disrupting local industries and political systems across Africa. Colonial economies frequently prioritized resource extraction rather than industrial development within African societies themselves. As a result, technological inequality widened further during the modern era. But history is important here because it challenges dangerous myths. For centuries, some people falsely assumed technological dominance reflected superior intelligence or civilization. But technology is heavily influenced by historical timing, trade networks, environmental conditions, population density, access to resources, and the accumulation of previous discoveries. Innovation grows fastest where knowledge flows most freely. And once one region gains a temporary advantage, compound growth can create enormous long-term differences over centuries. This is one of history's most important lessons. Human civilizations do not develop in isolation. Every society builds upon environmental opportunity, historical circumstance, and inherited knowledge from earlier generations. The modern world itself emerged through thousands of interconnected discoveries stretching across continents and cultures. Paper from China. Mathematics from the Islamic world. Agriculture from multiple continents. Metallurgy from ancient civilizations. Navigation from centuries of shared exploration. Human progress has always been collective. And beneath the rise of empires and industrial powers lies a quieter truth. Civilization advances wherever knowledge survives long enough to grow. For thousands of years, African civilizations developed along their own historical paths. Kingdoms rose beside rivers and deserts. Trade routes crossed the Sahara carrying gold, salt, ivory, and knowledge between distant societies. Empires expanded and collapsed. Languages, religions, cultures, and political systems evolved across enormous regions of the continent. Then, beginning gradually in the 15th century, outside powers arrived from across the sea. And history changed violently. European exploration initially focused on trade. Portuguese ships sailing along Africa's coasts searched for gold, spices, and new maritime routes connecting Europe to Asia. Coastal trade networks expanded, linking African kingdoms to growing global commerce. But soon another system emerged, one of the darkest systems in human history: the Atlantic slave trade. For centuries, millions of African men, women, and children were captured, sold, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean under horrifying conditions. Families were torn apart. Entire communities disappeared. Human beings became commodities within a massive economic machine powering plantation economies in the Americas. The scale of devastation was enormous. Some regions lost large portions of their populations through slave raids, warfare, and forced deportation. Political instability increased as rival groups competed within systems fueled by European demand for enslaved labor. Africa's development was no longer unfolding naturally. It was being violently redirected. Meanwhile, Europe was entering the Industrial Revolution. Factories, steam engines, railways, advanced weapons, and industrial economies dramatically increased European power during the 18th and 19th centuries. Industrial nations demanded raw materials, labor, and new markets to support expanding economies. Africa became a target. By the late 19th century, European empires began rapidly dividing the continent between themselves during what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, and other colonial powers claimed enormous territories with little regard for the peoples already living there. Borders were drawn artificially across maps in European conference rooms. Ancient ethnic, cultural, and political boundaries were ignored completely. Communities that had lived separately for centuries were forced together under colonial rule, while others were divided apart by arbitrary borders that still exist today. Colonial governments focused primarily on extraction: gold, rubber, diamonds, minerals, cash crops. African economies were reorganized to benefit European industries rather than local populations. Railways and infrastructure often existed mainly to move resources from inland regions toward coastal ports for export abroad. At the same time, colonial systems disrupted traditional political structures. Some African kings and leaders were removed. Others were manipulated into cooperation. Local industries struggled against imported European goods. Education systems often promoted European languages, values, and historical narratives while portraying African cultures as inferior or uncivilized. In many colonies, violence enforced control. Perhaps no example was more horrifying than the Congo Free State under Belgian King Leopold II, where forced labor and brutality led to the deaths of millions. Across the continent, resistance movements emerged as African societies fought against foreign domination. But European military technology created overwhelming advantages. Machine guns defeated armies armed with spears or outdated weapons. Industrial power reshaped global power balances dramatically. And over time, colonialism changed not only politics and economics, but memory itself. European empires often justified conquest through racist ideologies claiming Africans were less civilized or less capable of governing themselves. These narratives ignored Africa's ancient kingdoms, trade networks, universities, and civilizations that existed long before European colonization. History itself became distorted. The consequences of colonialism extended far beyond the colonial era. When African nations gained independence during the 20th century, many inherited artificial borders, fragile economies dependent on resource exports, political instability, and systems originally designed for extraction rather than long-term development. Some regions descended into conflict partly rooted in colonial divisions imposed generations earlier. Yet despite everything African societies endured, resistance never disappeared completely. Anti-colonial leaders, independence movements, intellectuals, activists, and ordinary people fought to reclaim political freedom across the continent. Nations gradually emerged from colonial rule during the 20th century, reshaping Africa's future once again. But the scars of colonial interruption remain visible even today. Economic inequality, political instability, resource exploitation, global stereotypes rooted in colonial narratives, all continue influencing how the world sees Africa. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of all. Because for centuries, Africa's story was often told as though poverty and instability were ancient, natural conditions rather than the result of violent historical disruption. But history tells another story. A story in which civilizations developing along their own paths were interrupted by conquest, extraction, slavery, and empire. The modern world was not shaped peacefully. It was reshaped through violence. And few continents experienced that redirection more dramatically than Africa. Throughout history, physical differences between human populations have often been misunderstood. Skin color, hair texture, facial features, body structure. For centuries, many people wrongly believed these differences proved that certain races were naturally superior or inferior to others. Entire political systems, empires, and colonial ideologies were built around these assumptions. Racist pseudoscience attempted to divide humanity into higher and lower peoples based purely on appearance. But modern science tells a very different story. Human physical differences are not evidence of hierarchy. They are evidence of adaptation. Over tens of thousands of years, human populations gradually changed in response to the environments they lived in. Climate, sunlight, altitude, temperature, diet, and disease all influenced the human body across generations. The process was biological survival, not superiority. One of the clearest examples is skin color. Near Earth's equator, sunlight contains extremely high levels of ultraviolet radiation. Too much UV exposure damages skin cells and can destroy folate, an important vitamin necessary for healthy pregnancies and survival. In these intense environments, darker skin rich in melanin evolved as protection against harmful solar radiation. Melanin acts almost like a natural shield. It absorbs ultraviolet light and reduces damage caused by extreme sun exposure. This adaptation became especially important across much of Africa, where strong sunlight remained constant throughout the year. But as some human populations migrated farther north into Europe and colder regions with weaker sunlight, a different challenge emerged. Humans still needed sunlight to produce vitamin D, which is essential for bone health, immune function, and survival. In low sunlight environments, very dark skin blocked too much UV radiation, making vitamin D production harder. Over thousands of years, lighter skin gradually evolved in many northern populations because it absorbed sunlight more efficiently. Both adaptations served the same purpose: survival within different environments. Neither was better. Each was suited to local conditions. The same principle applies to many other physical differences. Body structure often reflects climate adaptation. Populations living in colder regions frequently evolved shorter limbs and broader bodies that conserved heat more effectively. In hotter climates, taller and leaner body types often helped release heat more efficiently. Hair texture also reflects environmental pressures. Tightly curled hair common in many African populations helps regulate heat and protect the scalp from intense sunlight. Straighter hair patterns evolved differently in colder or less sunny climates. Even facial features can reflect adaptation to temperature, humidity, wind, and environmental conditions over long periods of time. Human beings evolved as highly flexible survivors capable of adapting physically to radically different parts of the planet. But despite these visible differences, modern genetics has revealed something astonishing. Humans are overwhelmingly similar to one another. Scientifically, race is far less biologically significant than many people once believed. In fact, there is often more genetic variation within so-called racial groups than between them. All humans share the vast majority of their DNA regardless of physical appearance. We remain one species with shared origins stretching back to ancient Africa. Yet for centuries, these scientific realities were ignored. During the colonial era especially, European empires often promoted racial hierarchies to justify conquest, slavery, and exploitation. False theories claimed Europeans were naturally more intelligent or civilized than Africans and other populations. These ideas became deeply embedded in politics, education, and culture across much of the world. But these theories were never objective science. They were political tools. Modern anthropology, genetics, and evolutionary biology have thoroughly discredited such beliefs. Civilizations rise or fall because of geography, resources, trade networks, disease environments, historical timing, colonization, and political systems, not because one race possesses inherently superior biology. Human intelligence exists everywhere. Creativity exists everywhere. Innovation exists everywhere. Every civilization in history emerged from human beings adapting to the conditions surrounding them. And perhaps understanding this changes how we see humanity itself. Because beneath differences in appearance, language, religion, and culture lies a deeper truth. All humans share common ancestors. Every person alive today ultimately belongs to the same ancient human family that first emerged in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. The divisions we often focus on today are incredibly recent in comparison to the vast timeline of human evolution. For most of our history, humanity was not divided by race or nationality. We were simply survivors adapting to a changing world. And the physical differences we see today are not signs of hierarchy. They are living evidence of humanity's extraordinary ability to endure almost anywhere on Earth. For centuries, people searched for simple explanations to understand why civilizations developed differently across the world. Some believed certain races were naturally destined to rule. Others claimed intelligence itself varied between continents. But as we journey through the deeper story of human history, a different picture begins to emerge. A far more complicated picture. The rise of civilizations was never shaped by biology alone. It was shaped by geography, by climate, by crops, animals, disease, migration, trade, isolation, conquest, and historical timing. Tiny environmental advantages accumulated slowly across thousands of years until they transformed entire continents. A fertile grain, a domesticable animal, a navigable river, a connected trade route, a deadly disease. These invisible forces quietly influenced the destiny of civilizations long before modern nations ever existed. Europe did not rise because Europeans were inherently superior. Africa did not struggle because Africans were inherently inferior. Human societies simply inherited different environmental conditions, and history unfolded from there. Some regions possessed advantages that accelerated agriculture, trade, technological exchange, and industrialization. Other regions faced deserts, tropical diseases, fragmented climates, colonial disruption, and extraction by foreign empires. Over centuries, those differences compounded dramatically. But perhaps the most important realization is this. Despite everything that divides humanity today, we all share the same origins. Every civilization, every nation, every race, every language and culture ultimately traces back to ancient human ancestors who once walked across African landscapes beneath prehistoric skies. Modern genetics has confirmed what history often forgot. Human beings are overwhelmingly alike. The physical differences we notice, skin color, hair texture, facial features, are simply adaptations shaped by local environments over immense stretches of time. They reflect survival, not hierarchy. The idea of superior and inferior races collapses beneath scientific reality. Humanity has always been one interconnected family adapting to different corners of the earth. And perhaps understanding that changes how we see the modern world itself. Because history was never inevitable. The world we inherited today emerged from countless accidents of geography and timing layered across thousands of years. If climates had shifted differently, if crops grew elsewhere, if disease patterns changed, if empires never expanded, human history may have followed entirely different paths. The civilizations we now view as dominant or powerful are not permanent outcomes of destiny. They are temporary chapters in a much longer human story. And beneath all those chapters remains a deeper truth. Long before borders, empires, religions, or race existed, human beings were already surviving together beneath the same sky. The story of Europe and Africa is not ultimately a story about separation. It is a story about adaptation, a story about survival, and above all, it is the story of one human species shaped by the world around it, yet forever connected by a shared origin stretching back to Africa, the birthplace of us all.